Thank you for your time, everyone, and thank you, Professor Zargar, for your precious time and your enthusiasm in Persianate Sufism, and also participating in these cultural and academic events and sharing with us about you. Dr. Zargar, just like a question off topic. After Helmut Ritter writing the Sea of the Soul, I think, is there any serious work on Attar and his
There
thought?
is. So there was a Leonard Lewinson did a an edited volume on Attar, and it has some very good articles in it.
Oh, okay.
And then about a year before my book came out, Austin O'Malley came out with a book that focuses on Attar and Attar's homiletics, he calls it. And it's an excellent book, actually. It's very good. So it's Attar's doing pretty well. I mean, relatively speaking, there's been quite a bit of interest in his work. Oh, and of course, there's Kermani's. I'm sure you know Kermani's book. No, what is it called? The one on suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said that. So, what was that?
The Terror of God.
Yeah,
It's called The Terror of God. Attar, Job, and the Metaphysical.
I'm just curious. What is that Western academia? I mean, they are not focusing on, for example, Sanai or other Persian authors. For example, why Rumi? I know Rumi is the famous one, and Attar maybe, but why Sanai is excluded from this atmosphere of research? What's your idea?
You know, it's interesting how a lot of this works. So when have we started the program?
No, for sure, no. But, if I may, yes, please.
Why
let
don't we
me.
start it and make this a part of
Absolutely,
because this is a
absolutely.
great question.
Okay.
Oh.
So, assalamu alaikum, everyone. In the name of God, good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this special book review session. Today, we are gathered here to explore religion of love, Sufism, and self-transformation in the poetic imagination of Attar, author by the distinguished scholar Professor Cyrus Zargar. In today's session, we aim to explore the profound themes of love, union, and religion as discussed in this book. We will have an insightful journey through the intricate ideas of Sufi philosophy and poetic imagination presented by Dr. Zargar. Our session will consist of an introduction to the book, a keynote lecture by Dr. Zargar, an examination of the book's key themes, and finally Q&A session. Now, let's move to introducing the book and its esteemed author. Religion of Love was published in July 2024 by the State University of New York Press and is a part of the Sunni series in Islamic Studies. Professor Cyrus Zargar, our guest today, is the endowed Al-Ghazali Distinguished Professor in Islamic Studies. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies in 2008. Dr. Zargar's research interests include classical Sufism, Islamic philosophy, Arabic and Persian Sufi literature, and ethics in literature and film. Dr. Zargar recently completed a book titled Religion of Love, Farid Attar, and the Sufi Tradition of the Islamic Text Society. Before this work, his book, The Polished Mirror, Storytelling and The Pursuit of Virtue in Islamic Philosophy and Sufism was published in December 2017. His first book, Sufi Aesthetic, was published in September 2011 by the University of South Carolina Press. He has published several articles as well. He has spoken at conferences, libraries, churches, television interviews, and public seminars, not only about areas of interest to specialist list, but also topics of broader interest, such as Persian literature, Muslim life in America after 9/11, Islamic ethics, Muslim beliefs and practices, and issues of nationality and identity. And now I would like to invite Professor Zargar to share his thoughts and reflection on the place of Persianate Sufism in contemporary Islamic studies. In this lecture, he will provide an overview of his research as well. I encourage you to take notes and prepare any question you might have as well. We will have a Q&A session following the discussion. We are all ears. Professor Zargar, please.
So to respond to your question about the place of Persian literature in studies in Islamic studies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, okay, I'll frame it in terms of Islamic studies in what we could call America, England, to some extent Germany, and the reason why I'm framing it that way is that's what I come from. So you mentioned I come from a department of Near Eastern Studies. Why Near Eastern Studies? Well, area studies departments in the United States, became prevalent, especially after World War II, during the Cold War, because there was an idea that we carve up the world into these different regions, study their languages and cultures, because in order to sort of be able to compete with, let's say, the Soviets or with others, and kind of be able to do diplomacy, all that kind of thing, which was fine for the time. I mean, at that time, you have to remember how basic most Islamic studies was, right? Many of the most important texts, other than the Quran, in Islam had not been even translated, let alone studied. And then you had, you had, for example, Reynold Nicholson and A.J. Arbery translating some Sufi texts, and that was fine. But even when you look through their translations, you can tell that some of the basic concepts and history of Sufism completely misunderstood, right? Which is fine. I mean, that was the beginning. In fact, A.J. Arbery was my advisor's advisor, which I thought was interesting. So, anyways, now what ended up happening, I think, in part because of how Islamic studies was influenced by Near Eastern studies, Middle Eastern studies, and this sort of regional interest, is that what was deemed fundamentally important in Islamic studies was what had the most influence among Muslims. So there was a time when, for example, Arabic was considered in many of these Near Eastern studies departments more important than Persian, right? I would argue to some cases it still is. And in Islamic studies, if you were to say you do Persianate Islamic studies, that's still a pretty rare thing. Why? Because of influence and impact, right? Yeah. They think of it as the Arab world, and they think of it as these Arabic texts. The second thing that really interested Orientalists, and following them, the very recent generations of Islamic studies scholars, was the study of hadith and fiqh. Why? Well, because in Islamic societies, those seem to be sources of power and influence in a religious sense and also in a political sense. And so what fell kind of behind was the study of Sufism, and then behind that was the study of Persian literature.
Okay.
And I'll end here. I want to give you a chance to ask your questions. Just one quick point that I have to raise is that where did Persian literature start to kind of, how has it sort of made its way? Well, it made its way into these area studies departments, as a kind of, interest in cultural heritage, interest in the history of Iran. It's made its way into some comparative literature circles and things like that. And then also there's been funding from Iranian families, Persian families, Iranian families, that very often, because we Iranians in the West, we Persians in America and Canada tend to be secular, their interests in the literature were also secular, which is fine. But what it's meant is that I think is that there is a bit of a gap when it comes to the study of what we could call Persianate Islamic, let's say, literature.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, that's really what is the impetus behind this book. This book, my interest in Attar and the way I'm the sort of push in my book is to say, well, fine, we've thought about him as a poet, we've thought about him in the religious tradition. Let's continue to do. I mean, we thought about him in the Persian tradition of literary studies. Let's look at him as a poet within Islamic studies and within religious studies, and that's where my book comes in.
Yeah, that is fabulous. Thank you, Professor Zargar, for
sure
explanation. And my first question goes to the concept of love, if I may, and regarding Attar teachings and understanding, why is love so important for Attar in Sufi context? Yeah, please. Yeah,
that's an excellent question. Well, as you know, Attar has inherited a discourse from going from Ahmad Ghazali, Al-Ghazali Hamadani, and he's Hallaj before them, Hallaj, but really from Ahmad Ghazali and Al-Ghazali Hamadani, that emphasizes love as the reality of existence. It's interesting that at this point in time, we can take that for granted, that Sufism would be about that. And that's a kind of bias that comes from our position where we are today. That we would say, oh, well, Sufism is all about the love of God and love being at the center of existence. No, actually, it's not always, about that. There are many Sufi texts where that would not fit into the text to say that, the reality of existence is love. And especially if you're using the word ishq, the debates surrounding that in the Hanbali tradition.
Yes.
And the Hanbali tradition has a rich expression in Tasawwuf, in Sufism as well. So, so first of all, he's inherited that discourse. But second of all, I think what's amazing is the way he develops it. And he's drawing from Sana'i. We were talking about Sana'i before we logged on, before we started. And I'd like to get back to your really, really brilliant question about Sana'i. He's drawing from Sana'i as well. And he's making this statement. And this is something that at least a third of the book, if not more, is interested in. And the statement is pretty much as follows. If the reality of existence is love, and if the path to self-perfection is in becoming a lover, right?
Okay.
Is it possible that in some ways that could be truer and closer to reality than outward religious expression, what we would call outward expressions of Islam? Now, with the caveat that those outward religious expressions of Islam for Attar are incredibly important. Protecting them is also, and that's why a third of the book is devoted to that. Those are incredibly important. But is it possible that one could realize something beyond them? And so for Attar, because it is possible, his heroes are the heroes of love.
Yeah.
People who are willing to risk it all, gamblers, people who've fallen in love and lost everything, people who, incinerate themselves, symbols, which he brings from Halaj, like the moth and the flame, or, in Mental Qatar, the birds flying to their goal, or the Sheikh Sanan, or, Mahmoud and Ayaz, and so on and so forth, right? These symbols, they kind of provide a vocabulary for him to present this version, his reading of reality, right? And he refers to the Mazhab Ishq rarely. I think I found 2 or 3 references. It wasn't really current in his day. But I found that to be a useful phrase to describe this. Mazhab Ishq, the way, the path of love, or the religion of love.
So yeah, if I may, sorry for interruption, but you see Attar as an individual poet and individual thinker as well. Yeah, this. And he belongs to some legacy in Persianate Sufism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, precisely. Yeah.
And what about spiritual influences? Could you please be more specific about these influences, please? Because you mentioned in your book, for example, about Qutbuddin Haydar.
Yeah. On his father, Qutbuddin Haydar, on his father especially. But a lot of it is conjecture, because he does refer to certain people. He refers to Farmadi. He refers to certain people when he cites them.
Abu Alif al-Faramadi.
Faramadi. Yeah, he refers to them. He proclaims his spiritual allegiance to Halaj. And this is why Jami and others said, well, maybe there's a Owaisi connection, Owaisi connection between him and Halaj. There was, of course, a time when people sort of were reading a passage of his and assuming that he had a connection to the Kubravis. See, the thing is, the connection to the Kubravis would make sense because of his approach and his style.
Yeah.
But just because something makes sense doesn't prove it. And the passage doesn't really, it doesn't hold up. And I mean, I would say he alludes enough in his writings to relying on texts that I think we should take him at face value for this. That there were certain people, right? Solemi was like this. There were certain people who got their Sufism through texts and through books and through learning. And I think it's hard for people to deal with because we've been kind of inundated with this idea that Sufism is a guru tradition. It's initiatic. It involves people and the sheikh and the murid. I think that's true. But at the same time, it was a science. And it was studied as a science and a branch of learning. And I think that's where Attar comes in, that a lot of his influences were done through books and through reading. He says that. Regardless of the influences that might have been around him in Nishapur, and there were many, right? Nishapur, so rich, right? Regardless of that, I think it is a literary Sufism first and foremost that informs Attar. And that's why Sanai can have the influence he has. And Ahmad Ghazali and Ainul Qadat Hamadani, and even Abu Hamid al-Ghazali can have that kind of influence because he's reading these texts.
For sure. I have a question. It is a little textual, but sorry for that.
Yeah.
In the introduction of Tazkirat al-Awliya, Attar mentioned to Imam Majduddin al-Khwarazmi.
Yes.
And that's supposedly considered as to be Majduddin al-Baghdadi, the Najmuddin Kubra's disciple.
Mm-hmm.
So could it be possible from that phrase that we can interpret or understand that Attar in somehow was related to Kubrawi tradition according to his introduction on Tazkirat al-Awliya, Imam Majduddin al-Khwarazmi, because Majduddin Baghdadi was living in Kharazm and was martyred there, I think, if I'm right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please explain that?
So, okay, the theory is presented by Sheikh Azari Tusi in Jawahir
Yes.
al-Asar. And the theory goes like this. When he mentions Majd. So the identifying part of his name would be Majduddin, right? He would be referring to Majduddin. The most famous Majduddin at that time certainly was Majduddin Baghdadi, no doubt.
Okay.
And because Majduddin Baghdadi was actually from Kharaz, and from a neighborhood called Little Baghdad in Kharaz, it would make sense. But it seems like a reach. And there's another grammarian who's identified as Majduddin Kharazmi, Ahmad Khari.
Al-Khawari.
Al-Khawari.
Yes, absolutely.
So I don't know. Personally, I don't know. Paul Lozinski talks about this. You can look at that.
Okay.
He talks about it in his translation of the Tazkiratul Awliya. Muhammad Reza Shafi talks about it.
Also debate.
Zabur Parsi. He has a good discussion of it. I honestly don't know, but it's not a, how should we say, what they would call, what we would call in English a smoking gun. It's not a smoking gun.
Okay.
It's not a home run to connect him to the Kobrevis. It does make a lot of sense for him to have a Kobrevi connection. It just does. Anybody who's read the beautiful book Mirsad al-Ibad, you read Mirsad al-Ibad, it has the same fragrance and flavor that you find in Attar's writings, right?
Najmuddin Daya, I think. Najmuddin Daya, yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It has the same fragrance and flavor, and you could say, but the problem is that fragrance and flavor permeates Eastern Iranian Sufism in these centuries, regardless of whether they're Kobrevi or not. Okay. And so that isn't enough for us to make that link to put him in the Kobrevi tradition.
So yeah, you're mentioning, if I'm right, please correct me if I'm wrong, that later citations in Sufi Tarajem or Tazkaras or hagiographies, that's mentioning Attar among 12 famous disciples of Najmuddin Kubra is some kind of historical thing, and should be investigated again according to early Kubrevi documentations. Yeah.
It's because it's after the fact. My understanding is that those references are after his life. Look, at the same time, if someone puts in the work and investigates this topic and comes to the conclusion that indeed, there is enough evidence to link him to the Kobrevis, I wouldn't be surprised. I'd be okay with it. I'd be happy. It'd be interesting. In fact, it would make his writings all the more interesting, because then we could study his writings as part of a network of thinking, and there's so much great work being done on the Kobrevis nowadays. Shahabuddin Misbahi has a book on the connection between the Kobrevis and Ibn Arabi.
Yes.
And our friend Abu Ali,
Fad Abu Ali.
Huh?
Fad.
Yeah.
Ayad Abu Ali.
Ayad Abu Ali has done some just amazing work on the Kobrevis. Yeah. You've done work. I know you've done work on the Kobrevis as well. So, I mean, there's so much, right? And the Kobrevis, and the reason why these kinds of arguments work on people like us is because we know how influential the Kobrevi order was. Absolutely. It was huge. My understanding is that a branch of the Kobrevis is the only remaining lineage, Sufi lineage that still exists in China. There's one, and it's the only Kobrevi branch that's left. Yeah,
Eastern branches.
So they were pervasive. They were influential. So it would not be far-fetched. It's just, I think, to go from this one reference that uses Kharazmi instead of the more famous Baghdadi, because he's known as Baghdadi, even if he is from Kharaz. I think it's just that it's not convincing.
Okay, that's good, and that is. I think we should look for further kind of investigation and
For sure.
academic research.
For
And
sure.
if I may, Professor Zaga, I want to a little shift on our thoughts and go back to love and other paradigms. I think in your book, your precious book, you mentioned that Attar says that love goes beyond being a mere religious concept. It has the power to disrupt traditional religious structures. That is kind of a shiny phrase. Could you please explain that? Because beyond the religious concept, nowadays we need this kind of understanding and teachings, to have peace, to have understanding of others. And I found it very interesting and profound. Could you please explain that a little more?
Yeah. I'll give an example that really makes it simple and clear. So, let's say I think I'm not great at memorizing things, but I think I'm vaguely remembering a reference to Majnun, Majnun Layla, the Majnun, seeing the Kaaba and sort of disparaging it, saying that, well, this is nothing compared to the face of Layla. Something like this. I can't remember the line. I can't remember the reference, but I think it's in Attar. But let's just take that because that's something that if that we can imagine. Well, what's happening here, right? I mean, from a strictly religious Islamic pious perspective, that would be offensive, right? For someone to see the Kaaba and say this is nothing compared to the face of Layla, right?
Absolutely.
But from the perspective of Attar, what's he saying? He's saying that for a person who's in love, the face of the beloved is more beautiful than anything that exists. A. B. This is supposed to help us make a sort of as a bridge, take us from here to a place where we recognize that it's the face of God ultimately that's more beautiful than everything. And that, yes, God has given us certain symbols and rituals, symbols that we can use to approach him, true. But we shouldn't take those symbols and make them the end or the goal or something that is the objective. Rather, the objective is the face of God. And the way you reach it isn't by revering objects or rituals, but by falling in love with God, right? And so ultimately, it transcends religious symbols, but it uses religious symbols to do so. This is the interesting thing about Attar. Attar, in order to kind of get the kufr tariqat out there, you need kufr. So you need kufr and iman to get to the language of kufr and iman. You need it to get to this thing that transcends regular piety, quotidian, piety.
I think I disconnected for a while. Thank you, Professor Zagar. And yeah, کفر و ایمان به راه او پویان وحده لا اله له گویان. I'm quoting from Attar himself. So another question for you, please. Professor Zagar, according to your explanation, in Sufi tradition, we have al-majazu qantarat al-haqiqa. Means majaz is some kind of representation of reality.
Bridge.
And, yes, bridge. And somehow the representation means tajalli, some kind of manifestation of.
Yes.
So it is kind of mirror that lovers can see the face of beloved ones.
Yes.
On that mirror. Could you please explain a little according to Attar, because I want to our audience hear from you, from your kind of explanation. Yeah, please.
I'd be happy to, but just I want to say here that my first book, Sufi Aesthetics,
yes,
that was the topic.
Absolutely.
The topic was this very thing that let's widen our scope for just a second. Okay. In Iran, people who study Persian literature, Persian Sufi literature, I don't think doesn't seem to be much of a debate or much of a problem when it comes to erotic language. People are comfortable with it. It's there. Much of it is interpreted symbolically. Fine. In the Western Academy, in England, in America, there actually has been, or was especially, quite a debate, for example, surrounding the poetry of Hafez. There was an interest, and now it's a bit outdated, but there was an interest in, so when Hafez talks about wine and love and young boys and and beautiful women, what is he? What they would call a ribald? Is he someone who's indulging in these things?
Absolutely.
Is he a libertine, or are these symbols? Now, that question, while it might not be important in let's say Iran, I mean, they might not be asking that question. I don't know. I think that question it occurs continuously here, not just with scholars, but in the classroom when you're teaching these texts. When I've taught erotic poetry to undergraduates, it's a foreign concept for them that this might be God, despite the fact that Christianity and Judaism also have a rich tradition with the Song of Solomon and all that. Despite that, it's become a foreign concept. It shouldn't be, but it is. So I investigated that question using Ibn Arabi's thought and Fakhruddin Iraqi.
Iraqi, yes.
Yeah. Which is in some ways a more developed version of this than what you find in Attar. Attar partakes in it, but he doesn't reflect on it.
Okay.
Right? So in other words, Iraqi gives us the, lamat. He gives us like, here you go. This is the theory. This is how it works. And Ibn Arabi as well. He talks about, he gives us a sharh of his own erotic poems, a commentary on his own erotic poems. With Attar, you have to do that interpretation. He doesn't give you the keys, so to speak, but the idea that the metaphorical, al-majaz, the majaz is a bridge for reality, haqiqa, is a bridge for, is all throughout his work. It's all throughout his work. I mean, you almost, you can't think, you could think of so many examples you don't know where to begin. The most famous one would be Sheikh Hassan An, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? Falling in love with a Christian woman, right? He eventually sees beyond that and returns to God in a new way, much more informed than he had been before because he's fallen in love. The Sheikh before falling in love and the Sheikh after falling in love, you would say, you would think from a traditional pious perspective, one of them is pre-sin and one of them is post-sin.
Absolutely.
But that's not how the story works.
No.
The story works, one of them is pre-enlightenment and post-enlightenment, right?
Yes.
There's an awakening that happens.
Absolutely. Metaphorically, infidelity, I would say.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's a worthy question in the study of Sufi poetry for sure. And I think Attar is a nice piece of that puzzle. But I think if you really want to get into it, the Sufi writers who've reflected on it are even better to study. So I would push a student to Ibn Arabi, Fakhruddin Iraqi, Faragani,
even Jami, yes.
Even Jami's later, yeah. Jami's picking up on that and really doing a lot with it. Yes, very much so. Yeah.
In that kind of thing. And what is your opinion on Sam'ani, the interpreter of divine names?
Oh yes. Beautiful text. You're talking about the one that William Chittick recently
translated.
Wow. Yeah. Yes. Beautiful. I mean, there's so much in it. It's a commentary on the divine names, but in some ways an encyclopedia of Sufi thought too.
I mentioned, Professor Zargar, I have a thought, and please
Yeah.
correct me. Could it possible that we consider there are two kind of Sufi love, or better to say, a school of love in Islamic tradition? The one belongs to Sheikh Akbar and his disciples, understanding, kind of understanding. The other one belongs to, for example, Attar and later Persian Sufism.
Beginning with Ahmad Ghazali.
Absolutely, and spread in India later.
Yeah, well, it was spreading at the time of Ibn Arabi,
Absolutely,
because
yes,
remember Fakhruddin Iraqi was in
absolutely,
India. That's why I chose these two,
absolutely,
because what happens with Fakhruddin Iraqi is those two schools come together.
absolutely.
See, I should have made it clearer in the book. I thought people, would know that. But yes, you're 100% correct. That's why when Fakhruddin Iraqi comes and spends time with Qunavi, these are the two, as they say, from using the Quranic language, the two seas are meeting, right? It's where the two seas meet.
Majma al-Bahrain.
Yeah, Majma al-Bahrain.
Masha.
So, I mean, that's the beauty of it. Because then, he can begin to think in the Lama'at, like, it's an Akbarian reading of Ahmad Ghazali in a way. It's like you get to kind of bring the two traditions of love together. And I'll tell you something else
Okay.
that happened to me when I was. We're going back to Sufi aesthetics, which is fine. But when I was writing that book, the more I read Ibn Arabi's account of love, I saw so many parallels with Ahmad Ghazali and the Savoneh, that it came to a point, and it's in one particular chapter of the Futuhat. I can't remember the chapter number, 278, something like this. It's one particular chapter in the Futuhat. I can look it up, that this happens. That the parallels between what Ibn Arabi was saying and Ahmad Ghazali was saying were beyond what I would call accidental. And I came to a conclusion. I mean, because we, unfortunately, worship texts in a way. We're so focused on textual influences that we can't imagine a scenario where Ibn Arabi could learn about Ahmad Ghazali without him reading the text in Persian. But he's surrounded by Persian speakers and people who've studied this text his whole life, right? Not his whole life, but at least from when he leaves Fez and he's in, when he's in Damascus, he's in Konya.
Yes.
Yeah. There's so many Persian speakers around him. And by the way, he references one of them, the father of Nizam, right?
Yes.
As being someone who's close to
Nizam, yes.
I came to the conclusion that he must have some oral, it's a guess. It's not something I can put in an article. It's really just a guess. But Ibn Arabi must have had some oral familiarity with the Ahmad Ghazali's tradition of love. And he takes an interest in these matters, by the way. So in the Futuhat, Ibn Arabi tells the story of Ruzbahan Bakli falling in love with a servant, a maid. And the maid is like, abuses him because he's in love with her. You can tell he takes an interest in this Persianate Sufi tradition. He doesn't have, I would say, open access to it because of the language barrier. But I think he takes a real interest in it.
How interesting. Yeah. And I think Sadruddin Qunavi also authored epistles, would say, little essays in Persian. So Sadruddin Qunavi was well educated in Persian at that time. We know in Anatolia at that time.
Yeah.
There were
Telim Sani, which is the student of Qunavi, wrote in Persian, even though he's North African.
Absolutely.
Then you had Farghani studying.
Saiduddin al-Farghani, yes.
Saiduddin Farghani. I mean, he's very close with Qunavi, very close with Qunavi. And by the way, look at what he does. This is something that I'm telling you, you younger students of Sufism, this is like a door you need to open. There's so much to explore here. What does he do? He takes the love language of Ibn al-Farid, right? And he brings it into the Mazhab Eshq language using Persian vocabulary, right? Why? What is that? Because I think they saw a commonality between them and a need to sort of point out that these ideas were all related in one organic whole, part of one theory.
How interesting. I admire that. And thank you, Professor Zaga. If I may, I want to go to another question and another topic. And let's shift to union part of your book that you mentioned,
Sure, sure.
Attar and mystical experience. And could you please explain for us union as the culmination of love and how Attar is dealing with among Sufi writers? Could you please explain a little about that? Thank you.
I'd be happy to. So yeah, so just so because maybe the listeners haven't read the book and they might not be familiar with its structure. The book is divided into three parts. It has very short chapters, which I know is unusual in an academic book, but that's because those short chapters inform the three parts of the book. And the three parts of the book are religion, love, union. Religion, love, union. Those are the three major themes. The first part thinks about religion in the thought of Attar, which is surprisingly a neglected topic, but Attar was very interested in it. He was interested in, you know, the conflict between ishq wa aql, between love and intellect, right? And he really was upset with the entire direction of Islamic scholarship that was happening at the time. Not just the theologians, the mutakallimin, the philosophers, the philosopher. He was also upset with the way the fuqaha and others were studied. He was just really upset. And so that's the first part, is religion. Then love, which we've spoken about a bit. And then finally, it culminates, as you said, in union. And what you'll notice, by the way, is in the two major narratives that Attar offers us, that have that are a frame narrative that end in something, right? A framework that end in something. Let's leave the Khosronama Ilahinama for just a second. Let me just leave that one aside. Let's just talk about the mental qatar and Musibatnama. And I'll translate that for English speakers. Mental qatar, speech of the birds. Musibatnama, book of affliction. Okay. Both of them end in an elaborate presentation of union, right? With two metaphors, two separate metaphors that dominate. The first metaphor, of course, 30 birds, which is what is left of the tens of thousands or whatever of birds that made this journey, wanted to meet the sea more, but at the end, 30 sea more are left and meet the sea more, right? And so they realize that they are them. It's a mirroring. So the first one, the mirror, is the major image with this play on words. And in the Musibatnama, it's the ocean. Diving into the ocean, into the sea of, you know, of fana, of the spirit, where your spirit and the spirit of a whole, you realize that they're one entity.
Yes.
Losing yourself, drowning, really. Right? So he's telling us that. And by the way, as you know, but maybe the audience doesn't know, I'm sure our two members here who are Persian literature scholars, they know, but I'm saying people who are listening elsewhere might not know. This is very common at the time as the culmination of the Sufi stages. So in the Manazil al-Sa'irin, for example, right, there are 100 manazil, right, with the last manzila, the last one being Tawheed. But it's not, actually, that's not really one of the stages. There's 99 that lead to the 100th. The 100th is beyond them. It's not actually one of them at all. It's beyond them because you've now reached the stage where it's complete Tawheed. It is, and by the way, he uses, Heravi also uses, Khaja Abdullah Heravi also uses the sea as a metaphor for this. It is that drowning in the sea. Now, my interest was, I started to think, okay, now if I wanted to teach this in an undergraduate classroom, do I teach it as some interesting phenomenon in Sufi literature or in Persian literature or in Islamic literature? You could, but in a way that would be disingenuous. Why disingenuous? Because if you're completely honest with yourself, you can't help but notice how common of a theme that is in other forms of mystical writing. San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, right? Teresa of Avila. These are the Christian mystics, Jewish mystics, Kabbalah. Then go to the Indian tradition, right? And look at the Indian tradition and see how common of a theme that is. They don't call it fana, but it's then you see in Buddhism, which isn't a theistic tradition, but also has a concept of losing oneself and losing the ego, right? And you go on and on and on, and you're saying, wow, why would I study this as a metaphor in Sufism, almost like a philological approach? What's the use in that if instead I can place it within the context of religious studies and comparative mysticism and think of it that way, which is how I look at it in the chapter, right? I mean, to me, that is infinitely more interesting to say, what's really going on here? Does Attar tell us something about the nature of this experience that maybe could inform the comments and discussions that we are having in religious studies about what's called religious experience, mystical experience? I think there's a lot there.
That's fascinating. And I have another question about the ascent to the real from annihilation, for example.
Yeah.
And could you please explain for us celestial journey as a model and also union in poetic imagery? Please. Yes.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is a part of the third section, the third part of this book, where I discuss. I am thinking of it philologically, but I have to do that first, right? I have to think of it as part of a textual and literary tradition before I can think of it in this comparative theoretical way, right? So that's the part where I'm saying, look, this does come from something in the written tradition. And what it comes from is there's an interesting pattern that starts around this time, and you see it in Nezami, and you see it with Attar, of beginning long narrative poems with a miraj of the Prophet. There seems to have been some influence from the Miraj Nameh that's attributed to Ibn Sina, to Avicenna. But regardless of what it is, it becomes standard and beautiful. I mean, you can look at let's call them, the little Miraj section or Miraj Namehs in each of these narrative poems, and you can see that the poet sees it as an invitation for the imagination to fly, right? I mean, they're really, really beautiful passages. I just wanted to point out that textual legacy. So Attar is drawing heavily from Sana'i in the way he's thinking about he framing the Miraj as a journey of the soul. That's what he gets from Sana'i. Sana'i is able to take the journey of the soul and the Miraj and sort of put them in this kind of framework that influences Attar. The Miraj Nameh, which precedes this, also does that, but it does it in a very Avicennan way, Ibn Sina way, very philosophical, thinking about the rational soul. So to think of it as a super rational journey, something that goes beyond reason, is what Sana'i gives us, and then Attar draws from Sana'i. So I that's why it's important just to say, hey, this didn't come from out of nowhere, right? It's not that Attar is just let's say invented it. He hasn't, but he's developed it, and he's doing things with it. He's pushing it forward. Yeah,
that is interesting. If I may, I want to quote something from Ahmad Al-Ghazali.
Please,
Ahmad Al-Ghazali, in one of his Persian quotations, said مطابعت محمد آن است که او به معراج رفت تو نیز بروی. Following Muhammad is that he ascended to Miraj. You should go too.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Yes, that you mentioned this kind of paradigm that is very interesting to us, and we are approaching our next
time limit. Yes.
Yes, but I have more question for you. I will manage. I will shorten. Okay, Professor Zargar, what insights does Attar have about union that you found interesting? You mentioned before, but
yeah,
about
The
the
insights, yes, yes, that's a good question. Um, so as I started to look at Attar in the framework of what's being done in religious experience, I mean, there were some interesting things that you could say. So first, religious experience, studies of religious experience have moved away from a model that thinks of them as some kind of uh, universal thing, right? So earlier studies imagined, well, that there was some reality that connected all of these mystical traditions, and that they were sort of different ways of describing the same thing. That's possible, but that's not probably the best way to study them. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant. When you look at the differences, and in fact, when you stop ignoring the differences, you start to see how the differences matter. So Stephen Katz was the one who really thought about this and brought a kind of what you call contextual approach to the study of mystical experience. And he has this idea that what happens in mystical experience is completely informed by a language, a religious language that the person develops throughout their life, usually within a religious tradition. Meaning, if you're Jewish and you have a mystical experience, your experiences within Judaism have affected it. Or if you're Christian, right, that's why you see Jesus when you have the mystical experience. There's a language that's developed, and that's now what I found interesting about that was, if you look at the structure of the Musibatnameh, right, the Salik Fetrat, the Salik Fekrat, the wayfarer who's contemplative wayfarer, right? What does he do? He goes through these signs in the horizons and then in himself, but first in the horizons. He develops a vocabulary first and foremost, right? He meets the world, the different planets, he meets the prophet, he meets Iblis, he gets to know this kind of, now none of them have the answer he's looking for. It's true. It's a journey.
Yeah.
But instead of it being a series of disappointments, what you start to see what Attar's doing, because each of them introduces what happens. For those who haven't read the Musibatnameh, there'll be a kind of announcement of what that thing is and how great it is, or what it does and what makes it what it is. And then a kind of disappointment where the Salik doesn't get what, it's not the answer that in other words, all the entities, the religious entities that a person needs and the cosmological entities that a person needs to know reality, first have to be introduced. He has to have a language before he can transcend that language. He transcends that language by going inward, right? By going inward from the senses to the imagination, to the intellect, to the heart, and to the spirit. But before he can do that, he goes through a process that I think in some ways resembles what Stephen Katz is saying, which is that you need some kind of language to transcend. You don't just transcend any sort of constructed reality. You transcend a reality that is constructed based on the vocabulary of that religious tradition. I think that's fascinating that Attar has that there.
That is very interesting, Professor Zargar. Thank you so much. I have 3 more questions. How should we teach Attar to undergraduates?
That's a great question. Well, it depends on the class. If you're lucky enough to have a class on Persian literature, which I've never actually, I've taught Persian, but I've never had a chance to teach an actual Persian literature course. But if you have that opportunity and you're in the right institution, if you don't need my advice, right? You just have a week on Attar. There's plenty of translated texts. There's Lazinski's beautiful translation of the Tazkiratul Awliya. There's so many translations of the Mantiq Attar, more than enough really for 2 weeks, 3 weeks on Attar. And then there's all kinds of secondary sources that would be helpful to undergraduates in that class. For example, we were talking before the meeting, we were talking about the dearly departed late Leonard Lewison's volume on Attar, which is excellent, and Austin O'Malley's recent book, which is, I mean, so beautifully done. Austin O'Malley has done a great book thinking about the homiletics of Attar, and that would work really well in a comparative literature course. And then if you, I mean, as a reference, I don't think any undergraduate could really use it. It's such a massive book, but you know, the Ritter's Sea of the Soul, right? Yeah, that's what it's called. And Encyclopedia Iranica would be useful. Anyways, all that aside, but see, I think most people don't have that kind of opportunity. Most people are in my position. And that's where your question becomes really interesting. So I've taught Attar, for example, in a class on medieval philosophy. How? Well, what Attar is dealing with, and this is in the first part of my book, the part on religion, what Attar is dealing with is the conflict between ishq wa aql, the conflict between love and intellect, which is very common in the medieval world. You can look at medieval philosophy in Europe and see a similar tension. The anti-Averroists, right?
Yes.
What do they call the luminescence, the whole, that were fascinated with light and love, and saw the limits of reason. And of course, what comes out of the medieval period is a response to, in Europe, a response to Aristotelianism that then leads to the Romantic response. Absolutely. By the way, all of these conversations resemble conversations that are happening in the Muslim world between, let's say, Ghazali and Ibn Sina, and are picked up beautifully with Attar. I mean, Attar, if you want to present that issue to an undergraduate and you give them the Mantiq Attar, the speech of the birds, they're going to have a much easier time understanding it than reading, let's say, Ghazali, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think he could fit in that kind of course, or a course on Sufism, of course, or Islamic intellectual history.
That is very interesting, and you really answered my next question. That how do you see your book contributing to the study of Persian literature? And I would go to the last but not least. How does studying Sufism in Persian compare to the studying Sufism in Arabic, since you do both in your precious work? Could you please explain?
Yeah. So as per our conversation maybe 15, 20 minutes ago, I think both of us, we share an interest in the connections between Arabic Sufism and Persian Sufism. But I think if one's being honest and frank, they can't help but notice some of the distinctions and differences. So for example, as a general observation, and I realize that general observations can get you in a lot of trouble in academic discourse, but as a general observation, if I'm being quite honest, Kufr tariqat language is much more welcome in the Persian Sufi tradition of this time than in the Arabic, right?
For sure.
Now, Ibn Arabi picks up on some of that. He has a little bit, but look at the amount of criticism that he faces for some of the Kufr tariqat language, right? That the Persians in the East, for some reason, don't face. I mean, you don't see them, people don't take Ain al-Qazat Hamadani to task for that language. I mean, he was executed, but not for that, right? Nor Ahmed Ghazali, nor Attar. It's somehow okay, because I think genre-wise it works. It's picked up in the poetic tradition. I've seen some Kufr tariqat language in Arabic Sufi poetry too. Even in a poet earlier than Attar in Spain, I'm trying to remember who it was, but I've seen it, and we all have. And of course, Hallaj writes in Arabic, and there's no greater example of Kufr tariqat than Hallaj. But I think if I had to make a general observation, it would be that's one interesting one for me. Why is it that it's far more accepted, commonplace in Persian writing than it is in Arabic writing. That's interesting for me. The love, cosmological love language seems to pick up earlier in the Persian Sufi tradition. It seems that way, but that's just, I haven't read everything, so it's just a judgment on my part. Yeah, and essentially, I think I'll end with this observation. When you study classical Sufism, you're not just studying words and texts, you're studying people and places.
Absolutely.
And right, and so in my case, Nishapur and that whole, the Eastern Iranian region informs my study of Attar and of Persian Sufism. And that's how it should be. We should really think about the historical specifics of what we study, even if Arabic texts were read there. Of course, I'm not sure how much Attar read in Arabic. I think looks like he mostly relied on Persian sources as much as he could. I'm sure he could read Arabic, but it seems like he generally, if there are two sources that present themselves, one Persian, one Arabic, it seems like he prefers Persian sources. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating. And lastly, I'll just say, I know that was supposed to be my last, but I have to add this. I think that Persian Sufism is more neglected.
Absolutely.
I think to me, Attar hasn't even often been studied as a Sufi poet. He's been studied as a Persian poet. Rumi, I mean, it's famous now. There's what is it? There's this, I can't remember the name, but there's this study of the kind of removing Rumi from Islam, removing Maulana from Islam. I wish I could remember. It's a beautiful article. But Rumi has been studied, out as a poet, but is he really studied as a Muslim thinker in Persian? Not so much.
Yes.
Right. That's what we need. We need to say, well, this is Islamic studies. This is Persian Islamic studies. Whether you like it or not, that's what they thought of themselves, right? They didn't think of themselves as writing in a secular tradition, even if we'd like to place them in such. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, that was interesting to me, that they were not invisible, that they are there and should be studied, their works, their kind of understanding, and from most the climate, that the circumstances that they were dealing with at that time. For example, Rumi wrote something about Sufism, but during his works, he's mentioning about Islamic kind of ideas, not in religious kind of thinking, in Sufi path, in Sufi kind of thinking, and it should be reconstructed again, and redefined, or reintroduced, reconsidered. So as we approach, I want to ask my question, because some kind of question raised up by our audiences, but we are approaching the end of our session. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Zargar for his invaluable insight and for sharing his profound knowledge of Attar and his Sufi philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you for having this. I appreciate it. It was really a lot of fun.
Yes, and if I may, I want to ask for another chance next session, maybe, because our audiences, they are asking too many questions. If could possible that we manage another session, that would be appreciated. And thanks all participants. Thank you once again for being part of this enriching session. Have a wonderful day in Toronto, in Florida, and also evening in Iran, and other maybe it's afternoon in Europe. And we look forward to seeing you at our future session. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Professor Zargar.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you again for your precious time and heartful kind of understanding and Attar. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.